The morning the HOA tried to claim my entire Northfield as a community picnic area was the same morning I realized that these people weren't just annoying. They were bold enough, stupid enough, and organized enough to ruin their own lives without a single ounce of help from me. For context, my farm sits on 60 acres of open land just outside a small town where the cows outnumber the humans, and the humans out-crazy the cows by a long shot. I inherited the place from my grandfather, the toughest man I ever knew, a man who once told me, "Son, never argue with fools. Let them talk, let them walk, and then let them suffer." That advice stayed in my head the day the HOA president, Karen Lapwing, a woman with a permanently clenched jaw and a hairstyle that looked like it was sculpted in a wind tunnel, showed up unannounced at my gates with a clipboard, a whistle, and a full army of board members trailing behind her like escape parade balloons. She knocked on my gate like she was leading a raid, shouting, "Sir, according to new community zoning, this field is now designated for shared recreational use." I didn't even bother answering. I simply pointed to the giant sign bolted to the fence. Private farm. No trespassing. Violators will feed the bull. You'd think that would be enough, but no. This was an HOA. They don't read signs. They create rules to feel powerful and then break the ones that already exist to feel even more powerful. Later that afternoon, I saw them placing little color flags on my land, like they were claiming territory in a board game. One particularly enthusiastic HOA member even brought a tape measure, pacing around the dirt as if he was mapping out where his imaginary picnic table would someday sit. I stepped out onto my porch with my coffee, watching them with the same energy you'd use observing a group of children attempting to build a rocket out of cardboard, amused, curious, and mildly looking forward to the explosion. But the real issue started when the HOA sent me an official letter written in the most passive-aggressive tone known to mankind, stating that my farm was now subject to neighborhood use under the revised block covenant, and therefore I needed to relocate any livestock deemed potentially hazardous to communal gatherings. In other words, they wanted me to move my bull tank off my own land so they could host cookie decorating events and sunset yoga. I would have laughed, but the audacity was so intense that it short-circuited my brain for a full 7 seconds. I called the county land office to confirm what I already knew. My farm sat outside HOA jurisdiction, way outside. The HOA had as much legal authority on my land as a toddler has running a bank. The clerk on the phone even chuckled and said, "Sir, do they know they're not in charge of the entire planet?" No, they did not. And that's where the problem began. Because when Karen discovered that my farm wasn't legally under their HOA umbrella, she didn't stop. She escalated. She held an emergency HOA meeting where she declared me an uncooperative property owner obstructing neighborhood harmony. They printed flyers, posted them around the subdivision, and even distributed them door to door. One of my buddies who lived nearby sent me a photo of the flyer with a caption, "Bro, they made you the villain of the season finale." And it really did look like one black and white shady photo of my farm, bold red letters reading, "Warning, man refuses TO, follow community standards. Potential threat to neighborhood safety." They made me look like I was hosting wild alligator fights in my barn. Still, I didn't engage. My grandfather taught me patience, and I had plenty of it, until the morning I walked outside and found 20 HOA members strolling across my land with folding chairs, water coolers, and a freaking bounce house. Yes, a bounce house on my land, without permission. They'd even brought a DJ, who was setting up speakers on the back of a pickup truck. I marched down the field, waving my arms like an airport runway worker, shouting, "You can't be here." Karen turned around, adjusting her sunglasses with the confidence of someone who had just recited a paragraph from a rule book. "Actually," she said, "we can. The neighborhood voted. Your land is now an approved shared community area. The neighborhood," I repeated slowly, "does not own my cows, my crops, or my dirt." But she wasn't listening. HOA Karens never listen. They hear what they want and weaponize the rest. One board member even shouted, "We're doing this for the good of the community." Meanwhile, Tank, my bull, stood behind me chewing grass and staring at them like they were slow-cooked brisket. If it wasn't for the fence, 3 of them would have already fainted. It got worse. The HOA brought food trucks. They set up games. They started hosting what looked like a carnival in the middle of my pasture. One man approached me with a clipboard, asking if I'd like to sign up to volunteer at next month's Farm Field Fun Day. I told him the only volunteer activity happening today would be me volunteering to escort them all off my property before Tank expressed himself artistically on their shin bones. Still, they didn't leave. They scattered like pigeons on free bread. At this point, my patience evaporated. I called the sheriff. Sheriff Dalton arrived 10 minutes later, a man I'd known since high school. When he stepped out of his truck and saw the bounce house inflating on my land, he froze, blinked twice, and said, "Please tell me this is a hallucination." I pointed at Karen, who had both hands on her hips like she was posing for the cover of HOA Monthly magazine. Sheriff Dalton walked up to her, cleared his throat, and said, "Ma'am, you're trespassing." Karen scoffed, waving her hand. "No, officer, you don't understand. We voted." "Ma'am," Dalton replied, "you cannot vote away someone else's property." The worst part? She argued with him for 10 straight minutes before he finally started writing citations for trespassing. You'd think that would end everything, but the HOA reacted as if they had just witnessed the first injustice of a revolution. They marched off my land together, chanting something about property equality, which made absolutely no sense. For a few days, things were quiet. Too quiet. That's when I knew the HOA wasn't done, just regrouping. And I was right. One morning, I noticed a fresh stack of papers taped to my gate. Citations, HOA violation notices, fines, a warning for having unapproved fencing, a fee for lack of walkway lighting, a massive fine for failing to maintain shared green space. They fined me $14,600 for my own land. I laughed so hard I almost dislocated a rib. I bundled all those papers into a neat stack, tied them with twine like a little present, and mailed them back to the HOA office with a sticky. "Note, return to sender. Land does not belong to clowns." Thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. The next week, at 6 a.m. sharp, I woke to the sound of engines, multiple engines. I ran outside and saw HOA board members entering my field with lawnmowers. Lawnmowers. They were mowing my crops. My actual crops. I sprinted toward them, yelling, "Stop!" They kept going, wearing reflective vests like they were performing roadside hero work. Karen shouted from across the field, "We're landscaping the community area." I swear something inside me snapped, not anger, not frustration, but the pure, indescribable realization that the HOA was genuinely willing to destroy themselves just to prove a point I never asked them to make. This time, I didn't call the sheriff. I called my lawyer. My lawyer, Mr. Aldrich, is a calm, quiet man with the patience of a saint and the legal precision of a chainsaw. He reviewed everything and said the words that made my entire week. They're about to go broke. He drafted letters. He filed claims. He gathered evidence. All I had to do was sit back and watch. And I did, with popcorn, because as Aldrich pointed out, every trespassing incident, every damaged crop, every unauthorized gathering, they all added up. Financially, legally, catastrophically. The HOA had wandered into my land like toddlers wandering into a minefield, and now the mines were clicking. But the final straw, the incident that set everything into motion, was the one I never expected. Because one night, just after sunset, I heard something outside. Movement, whispering, footsteps on gravel. I stepped onto my porch, squinting into the darkness. And that's when I saw them. 3 HOA board members sneaking across my field carrying shovels, gas cans, and a bag of what looked like cement mix. They weren't here to trespass. They weren't here to picnic. They were here to change something on my land. Something big. Something they didn't want me to see. I followed them silently through the field, staying in the shadows until they reached the far edge near the old oak tree. And when I heard what they whispered, when I saw what they were digging around, I felt my entire stomach drop, because it wasn't just trespassing anymore. They were doing something illegal, something dangerous, something that would blow the entire HOA apart once the truth came out, and I had caught them red-handed in the dark. The sight of Karen and her co-conspirators crouched in the shadows, shovels in hand, cement mix spilling across the soil, made my pulse spike like a rocket launch as I realized that the HOA had finally crossed a line even my patience couldn't forgive. I stayed hidden behind the corn stalks, squinting, watching as they whispered furiously to each other, clearly convinced that the cover of night and the vastness of my land made them invisible and untouchable. My mind raced. Were they trying to bury something? Plant something? Sabotage some part of my farm? Whatever it was, it had the potential to cost me thousands, or worse, if I didn't intervene. Tank, the bull, pawed the ground nearby, sensing my agitation, and I had to restrain myself from calling him in to handle them the old-fashioned way. I silently backed away to the shed, grabbed my binoculars, and called Mr. Aldridge, my lawyer, who by now was practically living in my inbox, waiting for the next opportunity to unleash legal fury. He answered groggily, still in his slippers, but perked up when I whispered, "They're digging. Cement. Near the old oak tree. I think they're about to commit a felony." There was a pause on the line, followed by the calmest, most dangerous instruction I've ever received. Document everything. Video, photos, timestamps. Do not confront. Let them dig themselves into a financial and criminal pit. And so I did, creeping closer under the cloak of darkness, capturing every panicked glance, every misstep, every murmur of overconfidence from the HOA members who clearly thought they were invincible. Minutes stretched into hours as they labored with an almost cartoonish intensity, talking among themselves about making a statement and teaching me a lesson, oblivious of the fact that each shovel strike and cement scoop was slowly building a mountain of evidence I would later wield like a wrecking ball. By 2 a.m., they had managed to pour a half-mixed mound of concrete over what I would later learn was an old water line, clearly attempting to disrupt my irrigation system in a misguided bid for community rights. I laughed silently to myself because the only disaster they were engineering was their own undoing. Tank stamped the ground impatiently, and I could almost hear him snorting in disbelief at their incompetence. As I crept back to my farmhouse to wait until first light, I realized that the irony was exquisite. They thought they were being bold, but in reality, they were digging a trap for themselves, and I had front row seats to the show. By sunrise, the scene was even more absurd. Karen and her crew returned, wielding wheelbarrows and brushes, pretending that the night's work was some kind of authorized landscaping. I stepped out onto the porch, coffee in hand, pretending to inspect my property like an unsuspecting farmer, while secretly texting Mr. Aldridge every move. Karen spotted me and froze mid-sentence, trying to play innocent, but I could see the panic flicker across her face when Tank decided that their efforts were worthy of a reaction. He wandered near, giving a low, rumbling warning that would have made anyone with a modicum of sense run for the hills. Yet these people stayed rooted, bravely attempting to explain why they had poured concrete on my water line. One woman even said, "We're just improving drainage." I raised an eyebrow, taking another slow sip of coffee, and thought about how it would look in court when she had to explain how improving drainage required trespassing, pouring concrete, and risking felony charges. The day only escalated when the HOA filed a formal complaint to the local council claiming that my fence was intimidating and exclusionary, essentially trying to weaponize their own criminal actions into a complaint against me. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped my phone, documenting everything. Over the next week, things spiraled into a comedy of errors. Karen organized an emergency HOA board cleanup day to fix the damage they themselves caused, showing up with rakes, shovels, and inexplicably a portable generator. Meanwhile, I'd already filed formal trespassing reports, civil claims, and photographic evidence, each document meticulously time-stamped, each photo showing them in the act. The irony reached its peak when one board member accidentally poured water over the very cement they had left overnight, creating a sticky mess that required professional cleaning, at their own expense, naturally. I even emailed the HOA with a polite note suggesting they consider hiring a professional instead of self-sabotaging, which was ignored, of course. Days later, the HOA attempted to hold a community meditation session on my northern field, waving yoga mats and chanting affirmations in what I can only describe as a desperate attempt to regain moral superiority. Tank, naturally, remained unimpressed. I stayed back, documenting, recording, and keeping my lawyer fully updated. Then came the pivotal moment. Karen tried to rally local media by calling the story a righteous fight for communal rights, sending out press releases with her face photoshopped over heroic farm imagery. I saw the first report arrive and decided to let events unfold. The reporter, a young woman clearly exhausted from covering low-drama news beats, walked past a fence and nearly fell into a mud patch they themselves had created while digging. Her first words to Karen were, "Are you sure this is safe?" Karen fumbled through a sentence about protecting community, but the mud-streaked evidence behind her told a very different story. I captured the exchange, video, and photo, realizing that the HOA had finally done what every overconfident villain does. They exposed themselves completely. By the end of that week, citations, violations, and complaints piled up against the HOA members. Fines for destruction of property, trespassing, and negligence began to appear in the mailboxes of Karen and her cohorts. The kicker? The financial burden alone was enough to make the HOA board members squirm, especially after my lawyer sent a formal demand for restitution for crop damage, water line repair, and general harassment. The tension reached absurd levels when the HOA scheduled a board meeting at a local coffee shop to strategize, only to realize that every detail of the crimes had been meticulously documented, photos time-stamped, videos uploaded, and witnesses, like me, Tank, and several neighbors, ready to testify. Their confidence crumbled faster than a dry cookie. Karen, red-faced and muttering, under her breath, tried to reassure the board that they could spin the situation, but it was clear to everyone, including her, that the spinning had turned into a tornado of legal and financial doom. By this point, the community itself began calling Karen and the HOA members to ask why they were allowing this chaos to continue, leaving the board defensive, panicked, and completely exposed. And just when I thought the crescendo had peaked, I received an anonymous tip from one of Karen's own board members who had apparently realized they were in over their heads. The tip revealed a secret meeting planned that night to discuss how quietly resolve the property issue before it hits the newspapers. I smiled, knowing exactly how this would end, but I didn't act immediately. Instead, I positioned myself in the shadows once again, ready to catch Karen red-handed as she tried one more desperate stunt. And that's when I saw it. A flatbed truck approaching the northern edge of my field at high speed, headlights slicing through the darkness, Karen standing in the passenger seat, waving her clipboard like a flag of surrender, or perhaps of pure, unhinged determination. I realized that whatever was about to happen next could either be the final straw that crushed the HOA financially and socially, or it could be the kind of reckless move that would turn into a headline worse than any local paper could write. My heart pounded as I readied my camera, my phone, and Tank, silently praying that Karen's next blunder would be the one that ended it all once for all. But deep down I knew that with her ego and sheer obliviousness, there was no telling what chaotic, hilarious, and dangerous stunt she might pull before the day was over. The flatbed truck barreling across my northern field at dawn, Karen perched atop it like a delusional general leading a charge, was a kind of sight that makes sane people question reality. But for me, it was the perfect signal that the HOA had officially lost all grasp of reason, logic, and self-preservation. I ducked behind a stack of hay bales, barely breathing, as the truck screeched to a stop near the half-dug cement mound from the previous night, sending a cloud of dust and gravel into the crisp morning air. Karen leapt off the truck with the grace of a drunken giraffe, clipboard flying, yelling something about asserting our rights, while the other board members scrambled behind her, tripping over hoses, wheelbarrows, and stray tools like a Keystone Cops reenactment gone tragically wrong. Tank, my bull, had finally had enough of the constant intrusions, stamping his hose with deliberate menace, eyes locked on the trespassers, and I swear I could hear him thinking, "This is my property, and I will enforce it." I snapped photos and videos furiously, capturing every ridiculous moment. Karen waving her arms, a board member losing his balance and landing chest first into cement they had foolishly poured, another slipping on a wet patch and sending the gas and rolling dangerously close to a rake, and yet another attempting to negotiate with Tank while holding a yoga mat for protection, which he promptly ignored. The scene was chaotic enough to qualify as a natural disaster in a suburban circus, and I realized with glee that every second of their foolishness was building a legal fortress around me. I could already envision court filings, trespassing, property destruction, endangerment, and emotional distress, all tied neatly to photographic and video evidence that my lawyer had already started organizing into exhibits. Karen's face was a masterpiece of red fury, golden hair askew, as she shouted at me to leave the premises immediately, completely unaware that legally I was the only person allowed on my land. One board member, sweating profusely, muttered something about, "We didn't sign up for this level of hostility," and Karen snapped back, "Silence! This is about community integrity." I stifled a laugh. It was difficult to reconcile the term community integrity with the sight of them tripping over their own incompetence. Each misstep, another nail in the HOA coffin. And then came the final act of stupidity. Karen, convinced that theatrics would sway public opinion, decided to climb onto the half-mixed cement mound to make a speech about how the HOA was restoring harmony to the neighborhood, only to have the mound collapse under her weight, sending her tumbling forward in a spectacular heap, clipboard flying, while the cement spilled and hardened into a chaotic mess that now legally counted as property damage. The other board members froze in horror, some laughing, some panicking, but none helping her, because deep down, even they understood that this entire endeavor had crossed into the territory of criminal idiocy. Tank advanced a few steps, snorting ominously, and the collective realization hit them. Not only had they trespassed, destroyed my property, and endangered themselves, but they were now directly facing a bull that had little patience for moral ambiguity or HOA bylaws. At this point, I called Mr. Aldridge, whispering excitedly into the phone, "You're not going to believe this. They've officially destroyed their own credibility and property again." He chuckled, the first time I'd heard genuine amusement from him in weeks, replying, "Excellent. Keep recording everything. I want every second for filings." Meanwhile, Karen, now covered in cement and mud, tried to salvage her dignity by barking orders at the remaining board members, who were attempting to sweep up the mess with plastic dustpans like a high school janitorial club in crisis. I could barely contain my laughter as one of them accidentally dumped a wheelbarrow of wet cement onto another's foot, prompting yelps and a chain reaction of chaos that had them tripping, slipping, and colliding in ways that would have been funny if it weren't so perfectly damning legally. And just when I thought the absurdity had peaked, a neighbor, who had been watching the entire debacle from a safe distance, decided to film the spectacle for social media, streaming it live with a caption that read, "HOA tries to take farm meets bull, fails spectacularly." The video went viral faster than a wildfire in dry grass, and suddenly Karen was a laughingstock of not just our town, but the entire county, receiving comments ranging from, "Did they forget how to dote?" to, "Is this a new reality show?" I sent the link to my lawyer, who replied, "Perfect. Media exposure plus evidence plus witnesses equals maximum leverage." By mid-morning, the HOA had retreated, dragging equipment, ego, and dignity behind them, leaving behind a flattened cement mound, trampled crops, scattered tools, and a very satisfied bull who had established once and for all who really owned the field. But the fallout wasn't over. That same afternoon, letters started arriving at the HOA office demanding restitution for damages, fines, and court costs. Karen personally received a notice that her personal property could be seized to cover the board's liabilities, which, when she read aloud in their next meeting, produced dramatic fainting, screaming, and an emergency meeting to strategize damage control. I knew, of course, that there would be no recovery. The combination of public embarrassment, legal fees, and mounting evidence ensured that the HOA was not only bankrupt in finances, but in credibility, authority, and public trust. I even received a call from a county official, cautiously asking if I wanted to mediate before things escalated further, to which I replied, "No, let them enjoy the consequences of their own decisions." And yet, just as I thought the battle was winding down, Karen, in a last-ditch attempt to save face, announced a press conference to declare victory, inviting every local reporter she could find. I had a front-row seat from my porch, coffee in hand, Tank grazing nearby, as she stood on a makeshift podium, her golden hair glinting in the sun, trying to spin disaster into triumph. The reporters looked on, confused, as she recounted tales of community success, while the cameras accidentally captured the flattened cement mound, scattered tools, and mud-covered board members in the background. Every awkward gesture, every absurd explanation, Every desperate attempt at rhetoric only amplified the viral clips that had already circulated online. By the end of her speech, the reporters were openly laughing, some tweeting live updates with captions like, HOA loses war with one bull and one farm, while Karen's face turned 50 shades of red, matching the red ink of her mounting fines. And just when it seemed like the story had reached its peak, a low rumble came from Tank, a reminder that he was still present, still vigilant, and still capable of enforcing his own brand of justice. The board members, realizing too late that they were still technically on my land during this press circus, froze mid-step. Their phones, used to document their own heroic deeds, now became evidence of their crimes. I smiled and sipped my coffee, knowing that the final act was approaching and that the fallout from this one ridiculous, chaotic morning would haunt the HOA for years to come, leaving Karen with a permanent reputation as the woman who tried to take a farm and failed in spectacular, hilarious, and legally disastrous fashion. But just as I was about to exhale, I noticed movement near the far tree line. Someone or something was sneaking back onto the field under the assumption that the worst was over, and I realized with a chill that the final showdown, the one that would cement everything once and for all, was about to begin. Calmly over my phone while the drone captured every word, live streaming into legal authorities, media outlets, and the county office. Karen's face went pale as she realized that she could no longer claim victimhood. Her actions were fully exposed, documented, and broadcast, leaving her vulnerable to fines, restitution demands, and most importantly, the crushing judgment of public ridicule. The board members began scattering, mumbling excuses, leaving Karen standing alone, holding her clipboard like a relic of past authority, utterly defeated, while I called the sheriff to confirm that legal enforcement would now ensure she stayed off the property permanently. Tank ambled forward once, sniffed at Karen, and let out a final, low warning growl that seemed to signify the end of hostilities, his presence alone enough to prevent any further intrusion. By late afternoon, the field was finally quiet, the chaos contained, the cement hardened into a permanent reminder of HOA miscalculations, and Karen's status as a local legend of absurdity secured. The final documents were filed: restitution for crop damage, trespassing charges, and fines for every illegal act were formally submitted, while my neighbors cheered, offering congratulations baked goods and suggestions for more bull-assisted property defense strategies. Karen attempted one last desperate call to resolve matters amicably, but my lawyer intercepted it, politely explaining that the only resolution was legal compliance, public apology, and permanent retreat from the farm. The day ended with the sun dipping behind the tree line, casting long shadows across the field, Tank grazing peacefully, me sipping the last of my coffee, and the HOA retreating like a wounded army, their pride and finances crushed, their reputation irreparably tarnished, and the community left to marvel at the spectacle of one farm owner, one very large bull, and the undeniable power of patience documentation, and a perfectly executed plan to let fools dig their own grave. And yet, as I locked the gates of the evening, taking one last look at the field, I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen's spirit of chaos might linger, waiting for the next opportunity to overstep boundaries, to test patience, and to prove that some people never learn, leaving me with the faintest smirk, knowing that as she returned, Tank and I would be ready, and the story was far from over, but at least for now, justice, humor, and sanity had finally been restored. The shadowy figure sneaking across my field under the assumption that the chaos had ended turned out to be Karen herself, sneaking back like some half-crazed general determined to reclaim lost honor, and the sight of her tiptoeing over uneven ground with a flashlight in one hand and a clipboard in the other made me realize that the HOA had officially entered full-blown desperation mode. I watched from the porch, Tank standing alert beside me, nostrils flaring, muscles tense like a coiled spring, ready to intervene if necessary, as Karen crept past the flattened cement mound from the previous night, muttering to herself about reclaiming control and restoring community balance, completely unaware that every move was being captured on my new drone camera hovering silently above, streaming in real time to my lawyer, Mr. Aldridge, who whispered into the earpiece, "Do nothing. Yet, let her prove every illegal act herself." I leaned back with a sense of grim satisfaction, sipping my coffee as Karen's silhouette slipped between the rows of crops, stepping carefully over the tools they left behind, her golden hair sticking out in wild angles like a halo of chaos. Then she stopped abruptly, squinting at the far edge of the field near the oak tree, where the remains of her own construction efforts, half-dried cement, scattered tools, and a warning from Tank, stood as a monument to her hubris. Her gaze lingered, the tension in her shoulders unmistakable, as if she suddenly realized she had underestimated not just me, but the land itself, the bull, and the sheer consequences of her actions. Slowly, methodically, she began pacing, trying to find a loophole, a justification, any excuse to salvage what little dignity she had left, muttering phrases like, "the covenant allows," and "we must protect community rights," while the words fell flat against the reality of legal filings, viral videos, and financial claims that were already in motion. I stepped off the porch silently, watching her like a hawk, Tank padding beside me, each hoof step a warning, and for a brief moment Karen froze, as though sensing the danger she had completely ignored in her obsession with authority. The sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the field, illuminating the chaos of trampled crops, flattened cement, and scattered tools that now bore silent witness to her incompetence, while her board members, slowly emerging from the brush after hiding from both me and Tank the previous day, peeked cautiously, whispering frantic reassurances to each other that they could fix it before anyone noticed, completely unaware that the legal and media storm was already swallowing them whole. By mid-morning, Karen had decided on a bold strategy. She would confront me directly, claiming that the situation was a misunderstanding and that the farm could still serve the community. She marched toward me with the audacity of someone who had survived multiple disasters without learning a single lesson, her clipboard raised like a shield, while Tank, now fully aware of the intruder's intentions, let out a low, resonant growl that seemed to vibrate through the very soil. I met her halfway, arms crossed, coffee in hand, pretending calm while secretly enjoying the poetic justice of the moment, as Karen attempted a series of convoluted explanations, ranging from zoning misinterpretations to emergency community welfare measures, all while slipping repeatedly over wet patches of mud, narrowly avoiding further cement casualties. I reminded her calmly, pointing to the flattened mound and scattered debris, that trespassing, destruction of property, and reckless endangerment were crimes with real consequences, and that all her previous attempts to assert authority had been documented in exhaustive detail. She gasped, sputtering, and for the first time, I noticed the tiniest flicker of doubt in her expression, an inkling that perhaps her grand plan had been more foolish than brilliant. That hesitation, however, did not last long, as she attempted to salvage control by calling out to the board members, who were now cautiously gathering behind her like frightened students awaiting punishment, to mobilize and defend the community. The irony was almost too much. They were defending nothing except the embarrassment of their own making, and their panic was palpable. As the tension mounted, I activated the drone's camera to capture the final tableau. Karen, golden hair wild, clutching her clipboard like a lifeline, surrounded by collapsing tools, cement debris, and terrified board members, while Tank, majestic and terrifying, positioned himself between us, asserting dominion over the field with silent authority. Meanwhile, my neighbors, who had been watching from a safe distance, began gathering on their porches and balconies, whispering excitedly, taking photos and videos, and sharing the unfolding spectacle across social media, ensuring that the HOA's humiliation was not confined to private documentation, but now a public phenomenon. Karen's desperation escalated. She tried to issue commands, negotiate, and plead, but the combination of legal threat, viral media exposure, and the looming presence of my very large bull made her efforts comically ineffective. Then came the final stroke of genius. Mr. Aldridge called me discreetly, instructing that I issue a formal public statement outlining all trespasses, damages, and attempted illegal modifications, which I did.